The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Vivienne Osei-Boateng almost didn't answer it. She was still in her coat. She'd just walked through the door of her house in Westmount, set her bag on the bench by the stairs, and stood there for a moment the way she always did after a long day, not quite ready to let the evening begin. 43 years of surgery. She still couldn't walk through her own front door without pausing at the threshold, like some part of her was always checking, "Am I still standing?" The phone buzzed on the hall table. Unknown number, Quebec area code. She picked up. Dr. Osei-Boateng. A man's voice, clipped, official. "This is Sergeant Gilles Traya, Montreal Police. District 12. I apologize for the hour." She waited. "We have a situation at Saint Justine. Your name came up." "My name comes up a lot," she said. "That's usually not why someone calls at midnight." There was a pause on the other end. And then the sergeant said something that made her close her eyes. He told her who the patient was. "Let's go back, because this story doesn't start at midnight. It starts 6 weeks earlier, on a Wednesday afternoon in October, in a parking garage on Rue Sherbrooke, when a security guard named Luc Marquette decided that a woman in a Mercedes had no business being there. Vivienne had just come from a 2-hour consult at the Montreal Neurological Institute. 62 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her forehead like a second pair of eyes, she was, by any measure, one of the most respected neurosurgeons in the country. She'd trained at McGill, done her fellowship at Johns Hopkins, come back to Quebec because she believed in this province, believed in this system, even when it made things difficult for her. She'd published more papers than most of her colleagues could name. She had a parking permit for that garage. She had it in her hand. She was pulling into her usual spot when the guard stepped in front of her car. She stopped, rolled down the window. "This is a reserved area," the man said. He was young, maybe 25, white polo shirt with the security company logo on the chest. He didn't look at her permit. He looked at her. "I have a permit," she said. She held it up. He squinted at it like it was written in a language he didn't trust. "Can I ask who you're visiting?" "I'm not visiting anyone. I work here." "In what capacity?" She let the question sit in the air for a moment. "In what capacity?" As if the answer wasn't printed clearly on the laminated card, she was holding 2 feet from his face. "I'm a neurosurgeon," she said. "This is my spot. Has been for 11 years." The guard crossed his arms. "I'm going to need you to pull out and park on the street while I verify that." She looked at him. He looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment, not recognition. Something harder, like he'd decided something about her before she'd even spoken, and nothing she said was going to change it. "Luke," a voice from the booth at the edge of the garage. Another guard, older, coming out with his coffee. "That's Dr. Osei-Boateng. She parks in B7, has since before you started here." Luc Marquette uncrossed his arms, stepped back, didn't apologize. Vivienne pulled into her spot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She'd had a version of this conversation before, more times than she could count, at airports, at conferences, outside the OR. Once memorably at a hospital board meeting where a trustee had assumed she was there to refill the water pitchers. She had learned, over the decades, how to put it away, file it, keep moving. But this time she noticed her hands were shaking. She went inside, she saw her patients, she did her job, and she told no one. The problem with telling no one is that silence creates space for other people's stories to fill in. Luc Marquette, it turned out, had a patron. His uncle was Raymond Fournet. Not the name on any door, not the name in any press release, but the kind of name that mattered at the level of phone calls and favors and quiet dinners at private clubs. Raymond Fournet sat on 2 hospital foundation boards. He'd been a fixture in certain civic circles for 30 years. He was the sort of man who believed, genuinely believed, that his presence in a room was an act of public service. He was also the man who, 2 weeks after the parking garage incident, sent a letter to the MNI's administrative director suggesting that Dr. Osei-Boateng had been creating a hostile environment for junior staff, and that perhaps the hospital should consider whether her temperament remained appropriate for a leadership role. The letter cited no incident specifically. It didn't need to. That was how Raymond operated. He planted the seed and let institutional anxiety do the rest. The director, to his credit, showed Vivienne the letter. She read it once, set it on his desk, and said, "Do you believe this?" He said he didn't. But he also said the foundation's annual gala was next month, and Raymond Fournet's family had endowed 2 research chairs, and could she perhaps just be careful? Be careful, she repeated. I just mean, keep a low profile, for a bit. She picked up her bag. I've kept a low profile for 40 years, she said. I'm still here. He's still writing letters. Do the math. She left. She kept working, and she said nothing publicly, because she was 62 years old, and she knew that a black woman who speaks about discrimination is always described as angry, and an angry woman doesn't get to operate, so she stayed quiet. Raymond Fournet did not. This is the part where the story could become simple, a villain doing villain things, a hero enduring. But life is messier than that, and the truth is that Raymond Fournet loved his daughter. Her name was Isabelle, 34 years old, a high school art teacher in Laval, with her father's stubbornness, and fortunately, very little else in common with him. She'd grown up watching her father pull strings, and she'd spent her adult life trying to untangle herself from them. She taught her students to look at things clearly. She believed in fairness the way some people believe in weather, not as a political position, just as a fact of the world, something you either acknowledged or got wet. On a Thursday evening in late November, Isabelle collapsed in her kitchen. Her husband called 911. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. They stabilized her, got her in the ambulance, and she was unconscious by the time they reached Saint-Justine, a bleed in the brain, the kind that gives you a very narrow window. The attending neurologist on call was good. He was thorough. He assessed the imaging, reviewed the bleed's location, deep in the posterior fossa, close to the brainstem, the kind of position that requires not just skill, but a specific kind of surgical architecture in your hands. And he made a call. He paged the neurosurgeon on call. The neurosurgeon on call had performed this type of intervention 7 times, successful outcomes in 5. 2 of those cases had been in near-identical locations. Vivienne Osei-Boateng had performed it 41 times. She had never lost a patient. The attending knew this. He'd trained under her. He made a second call. That was the call that went to Sergeant Gilles Trottier first, because Isabelle's husband, panicked, overwhelmed, reaching for any authority he could find, had called Raymond Fournet, who had called a friend on the police board, who had said, "Why is that woman being brought in?" And so, by the time the sergeant called Vivienne, there was already a quiet effort underway to make sure she wasn't the one who walked through those doors. The sergeant didn't know any of that when he called her. He was just doing what he was told to do. Verify. He'd been instructed. Just verify. Make sure she's authorized to be there. Vivienne listened to him explain this. She stood in her hallway in her coat, and she listened. Then she said, "Sergeant, what is the patient's current GCS score?" He didn't know what that meant. She explained it to him. "We don't have that information," he said. "Then I need to go in," she said. "Because if she's below 8, every minute matters." There was a pause. She could hear him thinking, hear the bureaucratic weight of whatever he'd been told pressing down against the simple facts in front of him. "Ma'am, I'm not asking for permission," she said quietly. "I'm telling you where I'll be." She hung up. She got back in her car. She arrived at Saint-Justine at 12:21 a.m. There were 2 officers in the lobby. She clocked them as she walked in. Not a difficult read. They'd been told to watch for her. They probably didn't know why. She didn't stop. She walked to the elevator, showed her credentials to the floor nurse, scrubbed in. The attending, Dr. Pelletier, met her outside the OR. He was 20 years younger than her, and he had the look of someone who'd been awake for too long and was very glad to see a specific person. "She's still stable," he said. "Barely. The bleed is in the right cerebellar hemisphere, coming up toward the vermis." Vivienne nodded. She was already moving. "What's her age?" 34. "Allergies?" Son documented. "Family?" "Husband's in the waiting room." "Father's?" Pelletier paused. "The father is. He's been making some calls." She looked at him. "He's saying he doesn't want you on this case." She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped, steady and slow. Is the patient conscious? She asked. No. Is there another surgeon with my specific experience in posterior fossa bleeds at this hospital tonight? He said nothing, which was its own answer. Then I'm going in, she said, and I'd like you with me. She didn't say, this is for the patient. She didn't say, this is not about him. She didn't need to. Pelletier already knew. That was why he'd called her. Raymond Fournet arrived at the hospital at 12:44 a.m. He was a large man, the kind of large that comes from decades of never being physically uncomfortable. He wore a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He walked into the lobby like he expected it to rearrange itself for him, and for most of his life, it had. He went to the nurse's station on the surgical floor. He asked to speak to whoever was in charge. The charge nurse, a woman named Saya, who had been doing this job for 23 years and had seen every variety of distraught family member, told him that his daughter was in surgery and that he was welcome to wait. Who's operating? He asked. She told him. He went very still. No, he said. No, I want someone else. Get someone else. Mr. Fournet, Saya said, with the patience of someone who has delivered hard truths in quiet voices for 2 decades. Your daughter is already on the table. The procedure has begun. There is no one else with Dr. Osei-Boateng's level of experience for this type of intervention. I need you to go to the waiting room. I want to speak to the chief of surgery. The chief of surgery is aware of the situation. I want, Mr. Fournet. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Your daughter is in very capable hands. Please, sit down. He didn't sit down. He paced. He made calls. He spoke to 2 people who told him there was nothing to be done at this hour. He sat down at 1:15 a.m., and he stared at the floor. And for the first time in a very long time, Raymond Fournet had no levers to pull. The surgery took 3 hours and 22 minutes. Vivienne came out of the OR at 3:48 a.m. She peeled off her gloves. She stood at the sink for a moment and let the water run over her hands. Pelletier was beside her. Clean, he said. It wasn't a question. Clean, she confirmed. She'll need monitoring for the next 48 hours. Watch for any secondary edema, but the bleed is addressed. You want to speak to the family? She thought about that for a moment. Yes, she said. I do. Raymond Fournet was still in the waiting room when she came in. His son-in-law, a quiet, pale man named Thomas, who had spent the last 4 hours holding a paper cup of cold coffee, stood up immediately. She's stable, Vivienne said. The surgery went well. We'll keep her monitored closely, but there's every reason to be optimistic. Thomas's face did something complicated. He said thank you several times. He sat back down and put his face in his hands. Raymond stood up. He was looking at Vivienne with an expression she'd seen before, though usually from a greater distance, the look of a man recalibrating, trying to find a footing that still made sense to him. Doctor, he started. Osei-Boateng, she said evenly. I want to, he stopped. Started again. My daughter. Your daughter is going to be fine, she said. That's what matters. She didn't say, you tried to stop me from walking through those doors. She didn't say, your letter is sitting in an administrative file right now. She didn't say, your nephew stood in front of my car. She didn't say any of it, because the waiting room was not the place, and because Thomas was right there, and because she had just spent 3 hours saving someone's life. And she was not going to spend whatever was left of this night proving a point to a man who already knew he'd lost. She said, get some rest, and she walked out. What happened after that happened slowly, the way institutional consequences always do, not like a lightning strike, but like water finding its level. The chief of surgery, who had been briefed on the evening's events, requested a meeting with the hospital's medical board. The letter Raymond Fournet had written about Vivienne came up. So did a pattern that the legal department had already been looking at. The way a particular set of complaints over the past several years traced back, one way or another, to a small cluster of people. Donors, board members, friends of friends, and never to her colleagues or her patients. The investigation wasn't announced publicly. These things rarely are. Luc Marquette, the parking garage guard, was reassigned to a facility across town after a formal complaint was filed, not by Vivienne, but by 2 other physicians who'd had similar experiences with him and had been waiting for someone to open the door. Raymond Fournet resigned from both hospital foundation boards in January. The letter of resignation cited personal health priorities. No one who knew him believed that, but no one said so publicly, because Raymond had always understood how to keep a room quiet, even when the room had stopped listening to him. His daughter Isabel was discharged after 6 days. She made a full recovery. 3 months later, she wrote a letter to the MNI, not to the director, not to any administrator, to Vivienne directly. It was 2 paragraphs long. It thanked her, and it said, "I know there was more happening that night than I'll probably ever fully understand. I'm sorry for whatever part of it my family played." I don't know if sorry is the right word, but it's the honest one. Vivienne read it at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning with her coffee. She read it twice. Then she set it down and sat with it for a while. She didn't write back immediately. She took her time with it. That was a thing she'd learned. Not everything needs a quick response. Some things deserve the space to breathe. When she did write back, she kept it short. She said, "You don't owe me an apology. You owe yourself a full recovery. Focus on that." She meant it. Here is the thing about Vivienne Osei-Boateng that her residents learned, eventually, if they stayed long enough. She did not operate to make a point. She did not help people to prove something. She was 62 years old, and she had been making the case for her own presence in rooms for 4 decades, and somewhere along the line she had decided that the case was made, not because anyone had conceded it, but because she had stopped needing them to. She went back to work the Monday after the surgery. She had a full slate, a 17-year-old with an arteriovenous malformation, a retired school teacher with a recurrent glioma, a 6-year-old boy whose parents had flown in from Halifax because they'd been told she was the best. She scrubbed in. She operated. She was good at it, not in the way that invites admiration, but in the way that makes people breathe easier, that makes a room feel safer, that makes you think, yes, all right, we're going to get through this. She didn't think about Raymond Fournet in the OR. She didn't think about Luc Marquette. She didn't think about the letter, or the board, or the parking garage, or the sergeant's call at midnight. She thought about her patient. She always had. That was the thing they couldn't take from her. And believe her, some of them had tried. The lights above the table were bright and steady. Her hands were still. She began.